Okay, I'm just gonna give a quick start. So thank you everyone for coming, and we'll also be having a live stream of the lecture, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the annual Critics Meeting. And Riga IFF Critics Meeting has been the place where to foster, discuss, argue about film criticism, and today's lecture in particular will be on criticality and how important that is from a very early age at schools. So our speaker is a seasoned film critic, Michael Pattison, who has worked for various outlets as Sight and Sound, and is also a member of FIPRESTI, International Federation of Film Critics. So please welcome Michael.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you once again. Great to be back. Less people here today. Weird. I hope I didn't bore everyone yesterday with my lectures. I did promise yesterday that I would show some actual moving images today. And since I'm a man of my word, I'd like to begin with a short film, which is going to be 4 minutes in length. The twist is that I don't want us to watch it. I would like us to just listen to it. So I've asked the technicians here to screen the film without the image and just the sound. And when we're listening to it, I want us to try and think about what kinds of images come to it might be images or on the way here this evening. It might be something completely different. And then we'll come back to the film at some point and watch it again with the images so that we can think even more about the nature of the viewing process and about the nature of our image making as a process. I've asked also for those of you watching on the stream for the stream to sort of cut out visuals while the films are screened. That's my decision. It's because some of these films haven't yet screened at festivals, and I don't want to compromise or complicate their festival life. But I do have permission to screen at least 2 of them. So, can we have the first clip, please? As I said, I promise that we'll come back to this, but I firstly want to tell a little anecdote. I'm currently a PhD candidate in film practice at Newcastle University. And as part of being a PhD student, I also teach other students. Earlier this year, I was a teaching assistant on a module teaching a group of students who are in the second year of their undergraduate degree. These are students who are filmmaking, they're making films. Specifically, they make documentary films, or as I like to say, creative non-fiction. In the first year of their degree, they study, the basics of filmmaking with an increasing emphasis on documentary filmmaking and the various concepts to do with film history, realism, authenticity, ethics, montage, Sergei Eisenstein, Ziga Vertov, John Grierson, Frederick Wiseman, Errol Morris, and so on and so forth. And in their first year, the students are 18 to 19 years old, by the way. In their first year, they are also introduced to what we call like issues-led documentary. For example, they'll make a film about an issue, let's say homelessness in the city, or something like that. Now, in the second year, as a kind of follow-up to that module, a sequel, let's say, the students who are now 19 to 20 years old are introduced to ideas-led filmmaking. And it's easier to quote the introduction to the module as published on the university's website. Could I have the presentation, please? There we are. Thank you. So it's easier to quote the website, as I said, for the module. It says, this is the sort of learning outcomes, if you like, or description of how the module works. Working in small production teams, students will develop their understanding of the coming together of theory and practice in the short film format. Students will be encouraged to be innovative in their use of form, drawing on fictional tropes as well as documentary techniques to produce both conceptually and visually creative content. This module aims to outline the principles and practices of producing a storyboard and script where appropriate that demonstrates relationship or a relationship between ideas, concept, theory, story, blah, 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 right? So I was a teaching assistant on this module and was introduced to the students without really knowing the extent of their film knowledge or even the extent of their interest in films. I didn't really have a good idea as to what, where they were at. And it was decided that in the early weeks of this module, the teaching team would introduce the students to experimental film, films from the cinematic avant-garde. Short films mostly, but extracts also from longer films. And I thought, like benchmark, obvious stuff, hopefully obvious anyway. And I thought that this would be a good way of not only blowing their minds, but also a good opportunity for me to get some idea about their film knowledge. So we watched Mothlight, the Stan Brakhage film from 1963. I'm guessing most people in this room have seen the film, and I don't really want to patronize anybody by explaining what it is. But for those who haven't seen the film, it was made quite famously without the use of a film camera. Brakhage collected moth wings, flower petals, and blades of grass and pressed them between two strips of 16mm splicing tape. He then contact printed them at a lab and projected them as if they were a film. It's pretty abstract, a film, for those of you who haven't seen. Lots of weird shapes and fast flickers. And it doesn't have any kind of voiceover or anything like that to sort of explain itself or to explain what it is or what it's doing or how we as audiences should be feeling when we watch it. I don't think the students did have their minds blown. I do think that they were bored out of their minds when watching it, though. I was standing at the back of the room and I could hear conversations between the students. I could hear giggling and I could see a sort of sea of upward glows from mobile phone screens, to repeat the film's 3 minutes. And it couldn't sustain the attention of these 19 to 20-year-old filmmaking students. It was only then that it occurred to me that for most people in the room, this was perhaps the first time that they'd even been exposed to experimental film, especially one that, in obvious ways, is so unlike the vast majority of movies that we consume on a daily basis. It also occurred to me that although there are more and more ways of accessing films now, and although more and more people are accessing them, you really do have to have some kind of structure or guidance in order to shape your navigation of or education in such a massive landscape. For example, similar to this, I'm sure we'd all sympathise with that moment of option paralysis when we felt completely paralysed by options and by opportunity when presented with an online streaming service such as Netflix or Amazon or whatever. It seems to me now that we spend more time browsing films than we do watching them. My point here is that it seems absurd to me that you can be interested in films legitimately and or in cinema, and you can go to see as many narrative feature films at the cinema each week. But unless you're actively searching to expand into experimental film, unless someone forces you to watch it, or indeed to listen to it, you're unlikely to be exposed to it. These works aren't really exhibited, for instance, outside of specialist screenings and film festival contexts, and they lack the funding and resources and institutional support to be publicised on a wide public scale. What happens then in the context of a university setting is that to formally study films, we have to in some ways unlearn what we know. We need to sort of step back and de-educate ourselves from what we know. We need to uncouple ourselves from what we take for granted, and we need to somehow confront and challenge and become aware of the ways in which mainstream cinema trains our critical thinking and our media literacy. It did this historically by monopolizing industry resources and by making its storytelling strategies pervasive and universal. What was best for Hollywood storytelling was best for everyone. And any different mode of storytelling became otherized. As a result, what many of us now accept as cinema is actually narrative cinema, so that anything beyond this becomes known in oppositional terms. For instance, we qualify anything that isn't mainstream by adding a further description to it, such as experimental film, short film, documentary film, and so on. So what are the learning outcomes today? I sound like a scholar and an academic now. What I want this short talk to do today is to demonstrate some ways in which we might turn film discourse and critical thinking around that discourse into something that's reflexive, into something that is attentive to and aware of itself. So I'm going to talk about and show examples of particular kinds of films, experimental films, that are in some way about images, or they're about spectatorship, or they're about the way in which we consume and engage with them. And I would love to stress throughout this talk the importance and value of screening these kinds of films to people as early as possible, not to indoctrinate or brainwash anyone, but I think a great deal could be gained in accepting experimental film into high school curriculums, and to train and educate people as a long-term initiative, not only in media literacy, but also in critical thinking about our own relationship and subjective relationship as individuals to the media that we consume. I'll show now the film that we started with, this time with the image. And while we're watching it, I'd like us to think back to the kinds of images that we were thinking about when we could only hear the film. And it's maybe interesting to see how close those images are to the actual film's images, and or how they might be different. And I think I find this exercise personally very useful in engaging students and encouraging them to think about how images work. So if we could have clip 2, please. 2 minutes. No, Yeah, clip 2. With image. Thanks. Yeah, that was cut short by the end credit there, but it's actually I made that film. I spent yesterday quoting myself or my own writing, so I thought today that I'd show some of my own films. I shot Dead Centre, the film that we've just watched, while making a longer film about the River Lee in London and the many bridges that cross the river last year in January 2017, a very cold day. But I want to remark here that when I showed this film to the students, they seemed to be much more engaged than they were when watching Mothlight by Stan Brakhage, but only because they knew that I'd made it. The lesson here is that you're much more likely to pay attention to a boring film if the person who made it is firstly somebody you know, and secondly is standing there watching you watch it. Anyway, Dead Centre is an example of a steady stare film. Stare as in to stare at something. The film has a fixed frame, meaning the camera doesn't move. It's tripod mounted, meaning its stillness is mechanical as opposed to handheld, and the scene itself continues regardless of what the camera does or doesn't do, meaning the action or lack of action, very action-packed film of course, but or lack of action plays out over time or across a duration. And the durational aspect of this is key. When watching a film like this, or when we're made to watch a film like this, our observational gaze as viewers is provoked by the lack of narrative incident. We begin to look at things that we might not ordinarily have time to look at. Similarly, because the camera doesn't move, we become aware of its stillness and the tension between what we see inside the frame and what we hear outside of the frame suggests plurality, suggests multiple meanings, suggests potential stories. Everything becomes of equal interest. Again, this is opposed to narrative cinema, which operates by guiding viewers through the image, using various techniques to do so, so that it can prioritize information that is relevant to the story, or indeed to the narrative. When I referred to this kind of cinema as steady stare in an article for Sight and Sound recently, I was quoting the British writer Ian Sinclair. Somebody asked me in the Q&A session after my talk yesterday which writers I like to read, and I can't believe I didn't mention Ian Sinclair, who is probably my favourite writer. Anyway, Sinclair uses the term steady stare surveillance in several of his books. And while he uses it primarily to describe CCTV, especially the CCTV as a recurrent element in how London's public space is policed and privatised, I also began to think of the term as a useful description of some of my favourite films. I mentioned Patrick Keeler's Robinson and Ruins yesterday, an essay film from 2010, and Sinclair wrote in 2014 about Keeler's work. Patrick Keeler, he said, he is steady stare, in control, counting every frame. Indeed, when making Robinson and Ruins, Keeler allowed his camera to linger, to record for much longer than he had in his previous two films, London from 1994 and Robinson in Space from 1997. It was almost as if Keeler was working on the assumption that there would be even more to say than usual about the landscapes he was filming. As another example of this kind of filmmaking, I'll show another extract now. This is from Home of the Resistance by Croatian filmmaker Ivan Ramljak, which had its world premiere earlier this year. Home of the Resistance is a documentary about the memorial home for World War II resistance fighters and youth of Yugoslavia, which was built in 1974 and which closed in 1991. Just for some context, I'll add that the site overlooks Kumrovec, the small village on the Croatian-Slovenian border, and where Marshal Tito was born. It's a very nice place, I've been there. And the extract is the first 5 minutes of the film, which lasts in general 48 minutes. Apologies for the image quality on this, and for the last one, it's because of the way in which I encoded them. But anyway, could we have clip number 3, please? In my article for Sight and Sound, I referred to the idea that the film, Home of the Resistance, unearths or uncovers some of the material layers and the sort of spectral traces still present in the manufactured landscapes and architectures of the recent past. The film's considered framing the attention it pays to the arrangement of existing features, topology, topography, architecture, emphasizes landscape and or architecture as a thing that should be looked at, investigated, pondered, studied. Indeed, the compositions of its images and the way in which these images are edited together forces us or encourages us to look, investigate, ponder, and study. In addition, by making a point of staying still, the film intensifies time, or rather, it makes us aware of time. It does this in two ways. Firstly, by allowing the shots to last longer than they would in a narrative feature, the film makes time felt. It draws our attention to the fact that we are watching it, perhaps in a bad way, I don't know. Secondly, it intensifies time, or the idea of time, by also drawing attention to history itself. In this instance, to semi-abandoned domestic architecture, which contains the qualities and textures of the past, or of pastness. And in fact, I like to think the film might be contextualized by the recent, this film in particular, I mean, by the recent much wider efforts to reappraise and bring renewed attention to Yugoslav and Soviet architecture. There's an ongoing exhibition at MoMA in New York at the moment dedicated to this, for instance, and you can cite other examples, including the sort of Instagramification of socialist modernism, or what Owen Hathaway has described as concrete clickbait. Another thing to say here is that the steady stare film in general is often defined by harsh cuts, by which I mean the hard transitions from one image to the next, from one space to the next. There's a nice one here where we cut from outside of the complex to inside of the complex. These shot-to-shot ruptures are emphasized also by sound or by sonic contrasts. So by going from birdsong to the interior hum of a room. The site is encountered and we navigate it as viewers in a fragmented fashion. Discontinuities between one place and another place are suggested here, but paradoxically, we might also think of these places or begin to think of them relationally, by which I mean in relation to one another. Thinking about this kind of film and thinking specifically about its aesthetic strategies, we might also find it useful to see continuities with or parallels with narrative feature filmmaking, even if we restrict ourselves to the so-called art house film as opposed to the mainstream films that we see in the multiplex. I'm sure everyone here can cite their own examples, but for me, Ramliak's film recalls Goodbye Dragon Inn by Tsai Ming Liang, as well as Phantasma by Lisandro Alonso. What we don't see in the excerpt that I showed is that eventually people begin to make an appearance in Home of the Resistance. Cleaners, caretakers, gardeners, those who are in charge of maintaining the building that the film documents. And what's interesting is that the inclusion of a human presence, or a token or minimal human presence, makes the otherwise unpeopled nature of the building all the more curious. We might also think back to Dead Center and the recurrent appearance of the local human. As in Goodbye Dragon Inn and Phantasma, Home of the Resistance simultaneously emphasizes broader absences such as a loss in architectural function, let's say, and makes us aware of our own position as human spectators when watching it. Again, we didn't see it in the clip I just showed, but one of the rooms seen in Ramliak's film is an on-site cinema. Empty, functional, but also in a way not functional because it's not used, which might push us further, because it is a cinema, to think about our relationship as viewers to the work. What's happening What's happening in these kinds of films? Well, several things. There are the in-frame dynamics, such as textures, energies, and the contingencies or coincidences of the actual world experienced in real time, such as a fly on a window or such as a cat, which happens to be licking itself in front of the camera before walking out of frame completely indifferent to it. But there's also a more reflexive component to this as well. The fixed nature of the frame helps to highlight any movement within it. Again, we can think of the cat or the fly on the window and we think of it because of the fact that it happens regardless of what the camera's doing. So the cat walks out of the frame, which draws our attention to the fact that a world exists beyond it. This poses, I would argue, fundamental questions about the very mechanisms of spectatorship. Move to ask why we're being made to watch something, we're also more likely to question our ongoing relationship to it. Such a process can, if you're so inclined, be enthralling, empowering, stimulating, even because it deepens and enriches cognitive thinking. We're not just watching a film, we're also watching ourselves watch it in a way. This is just two more examples there of what I mean by steady state film. I don't just want to talk about Ivan Ramniak's film. This is what I mean when I say that this kind of film encourages a reflexive mode of viewing. It's a viewing process that is aware of itself, perhaps unsettlingly so, but because of its unsettling qualities, it's perhaps more likely to be remembered. Remembered, we should say, and also applied elsewhere, because critical and cognitive mechanisms informed by this kind of viewing or by this kind of spectatorship, I think it improves our learning. It improves and develops not just the way we think about one thing, but also about how we think about and make connections between separate things or separate ideas. There's also the idea here of decoding. If the rhythm of these images allows enough space for our brains to work, or for us to become aware of our brains working, the composition of these images can often activate our brains as well. Again, it's this idea of investigating and studying a space and being given time and space to investigate, figuring out the architectural logic of a space in relation to another space. And when I say architectural logic, I don't necessarily mean architecture per se, but rather the compositional qualities of the image itself. Maybe it's time for another film, or at least an extract from one. P. Adams Sidney, the film historian, in studying and chronologizing the American cinematic avant-garde, defines the structural film as a cinema of structure in which the shape of the whole film is predetermined and simplified, and it is that shape which is the primal impression of the film. He wrote that book originally in 1974 when structural film was coming to light. I'm going to show a clip from another film now as an example of the structural film, but it's also a steady stare film as well. The idea of it behind this film was to take pre-existing topographical features in a landscape as its starting point. In this instance, the features are stone pillars in Ljubljana, the capital of Slovenia, which commemorate the barbed wire and bunkers with which the Italian and later German armies garrisoned the city when they occupied the country in the Second World War. They garrisoned it in order to prevent urban and non-urban partisans communicating to one another, and the stones themselves mark a 33-kilometer route, like a public footpath, around the city today. It sort of encircles the whole city. The film takes these stones as its structuring device, minimizing the visual compositions in such a way that the variations between the compositions are emphasized. Again, we can think of spatial discontinuities here as well as spatial continuities, and also think about the nature of our viewing process while we consume it. I think it's perfectly fine to become aware of your own boredom here, if that's what you feel. The point is that our critical relationship to the film is enhanced it's activated, and the viewing process is strengthened, again, perhaps to an unsettling degree. Why do I know so much about this film? Because I made it. Can we have clip 4, please? Apologies for the sound there towards the end of the clip, that's my fault. Obviously, these kinds of films are pretty films divorce, if you like, from something that just happens to something that is visible or doing. Some more examples there of the steady stare film as well as the structural film. As I said in opening this conversation, and I want it to be a conversation, it's not just me, part of the process here is about de-educating ourselves, which means becoming aware of the systems by which we were educated in the first place. I don't want to suggest here that mainstream films can't be interrogated or watched critically, or that they don't encourage a critically reflexive viewing process. It's rather that they operate within a different kind of visual logic, and that experimental film, by its very nature, is inclined to about itself, about the nature of its own imagery, and about our mode of viewing. Some films do this more obviously than others. Indeed, another difficulty in giving a lecture like this is that there are many, many, many different kinds of experimental films. I've spoken only about one or two of those kinds of films, and I'd like this conversation to be thought of in terms of just one possible suggestion among an entire field when it comes to ways forward in engaging students in this kind of material. So, at the risk of ending on a curiously random note, I want to finally screen a clip from The Migrating Image, a short film by Danish filmmaker Stefan Kroos, which I saw at 25 FPS, an experimental film festival in Zagreb last month. This film isn't steady stare or structural. It's an essay film, which is again, however, about images, how images are constructed, why they're constructed, and who makes them and who consumes them. I'm showing this clip not only to suggest other alternatives or other examples of films that encourage critical thought through their form as well as their content. I'm showing it also because I think it's a good example, it's actually a great example, of how films themselves shape and engage and guide our attention. So we'll watch this, and then I'm opening the floor up to questions. Thank you, and can we have the final clip, please?
Sailing across the Mediterranean Sea, migrants have enabled the image production in the European Union. No camera has yet reached their boat, but Frontex has 3 satellites in orbit, monitoring the migrants and providing large amount of images and data. The migrants are red and green dots on a screen, contrast in pixels and blurry vectors in the Mediterranean Sea. Frontex cooperates with Copernicus, a European system for monitoring the Earth. It consists of a complex set of systems which collects data from multiple sources. Earth observation satellites, along with ground stations, airborne and seaborne sensors. The European Space Agency provides artistic impressions of the satellite Sentinel-1B in orbit. The impression is done by an unknown artist. Frontex also looks beyond the borders of EU to spot migrants. This is an image of the Libyan coast, published by Frontex. Frontex rarely exposes the satellite images they create. But on October 6, 2016, Frontex released this image with following text. Frontex Situation Center, in cooperation with EMSA, spotted several small boats on a satellite scan of an area close to the Libyan coast, where migrant boats in distress are often detected. More than 370 people were rescued off the Libyan coast this week, after their vessels were detected on satellite images taken as part of the Frontex Eurosur fusion services. The European Union also provides images. The audiovisual department of the Union creates these images that, according to them, are free for use in editorial broadcast, webcast, print, online, and radio reports. Each video comes with a title and a set of video details. It seems that the main goal of these images is to be down working, the equipment and the software they use. The goal of these images is to depict the work done by the European Union to ensure its borders. I would like to know 2 basic acts. The direction of the camera follows a repetitive pattern: long stills, slow pans, fast focus, and quick movements that underlines the context. The logos and buildings of the European Union have a main role in these images. The sound is lowered to a minimum and the editing is scattered, which makes it impossible to get any actual information from these images. The underlying context cannot be misunderstood. These images are showing people at work, protecting the borders of Europe, looking at screens, having meetings, in monitoring halls, in airplanes, and in security boats.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Also, for this lecture in order to take place, very warm thanks to British Council in Latvia. With their support, it wouldn't have been possible. But now, does anyone have a question already for Michael? No, then I will use my opportunity and ask my own. As you ended your presentation with images that could also be interpreted news materials, and this also brings me to a very very important aspect of criticality and also visual literacy, which is distinguishing fake news from the real news, because I think that is nowadays, especially for younger generations who grow up overwhelmed by visual materials, I think that is one of the key points if we want to continue having a healthy society.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the short text I wrote to promote this lecture, I said something about, media literacy or something like that, and how the ongoing implication here, although I didn't explicitly connect what I was saying to how we might apply it to outside of academia or whatnot, is, yeah, I mean, it's not teaching people what to think, but how to think. And I think that's deeply important, especially if you're going to incorporate films into school curricula or curriculums from an early age, right? It's not to sort of indoctrinate certain ideologies, which, as we know, cinema can be actually very good at, because, you know, I think for the vast majority of us, we learn through images, and obviously Hollywood, in developing the feature film and whatever else, utilize these materials because they knew it could be profit, or could, you know, we could extract capital from it. And then, of course, as other filmmakers begin to get to grips with the tools of filmmaking and making images, and editing and montage, deeply important here, in creating meanings between images, that's when sort of, you know, propaganda and state-sponsored filmmaking comes into play. I think it's deeply important to establish a connection between the media consume leisure and the media are sort of, we like to use the term passive, but, you know, the media, I mean, media's right, it's there, and we have to find ways in which to discern and discriminate, which is why yesterday I was talking at length about crisis, and that being embedded within criticism, because it's about drawing attention to the ways in which we think, and actually, and you know, the etymology of the term criticism and crisis. At one point, they did mean to sort of judge, or it did just mean the result of a trial, and to discriminate. And I think it's really important to be able to discriminate between different narratives and different kinds of images. You know, who makes films and why and how.
Actually, but when watching the fragments from the films you shown us, a thought came into my mind that this is obviously, as you all seen, exact opposite of what we are seeing in children's and youth content. Okay, let's divide maybe children's content, but it is exactly opposite of what we see in youth content, because youth content in mainstream filmmaking is super fast, it's super energetic, and I mean it recently it gives the impression that it was made in order not to leave any space for thought for the spectators. And as there have been numerous reports that boredom is also a very important part of creativity, and also leaving your brain to work or to be creative at times is also very useful.
Yeah, and it's not just the cinema screen that is competing for kids' attention these days. And there's ongoing research now into, you know, children's YouTube, and the kind of sinister results and even aesthetic strategies of the kinds of algorithmic videos that are being produced to be consumed by children. I remember watching My Life as a Dog, the Swedish film, which is, you know, a coming-of-age film made not for children per se, but for younger audiences. And I've really found it, I watched it at the time at which I was beginning to expand beyond, you know, Western or Anglophone cinema. And I was taken aback by actually how slow it was compared to, you know, the coming-of-age films that I had grown up with. I mentioned James Benning there, his California trilogy, El Valle Centro, Lost, and Segovia. James Benning is a filmmaker. He is also a teacher of film at Cal Arts in California. And he actually screened the California trilogy to school children in America, which I thought was quite an ordeal for them, I can imagine. But, you know, the films, each film I think lasts around 95 minutes, and each contains 105 shots of 90 minutes in length. And they're creating patterns between the images and the compositions, but they're all found spaces in Los Angeles County. And he said, it's interesting, in an interview he said afterwards, you know, there was obviously various or varying, sorry, engagements with the film, right? And it's fine if your attention fluctuates. And obviously, some people are going to be more turned on by this kind of cinema than others. And he said one of the things that did unite the kids when he screened the film is that they were all very concerned about him and wondering if he was okay, because he'd been filming like burning oil wells and those kinds of, increasingly common sites within that landscape. Back in 2000, I guess, forest fires weren't as pervasive as they are now on 24/7 news channels. So that was interesting, how kids were kind of interested in the process of it rather than sort of the meaning. But I think that's fine as well, as, they were sufficiently engaged anyway.
Also, speaking about patterns, I think everyone in the room who has seen, I don't know, 3, 5, 10 Hollywood movies, preferably in a row, you can see that Hollywood mainstream movies, of course, that nothing is grosso modo changing. It's the dramaturgy is still the same, and I think if we consume these films in very large quantities, which is good for entertainment, but it still leaves very dangerous impact on how we perceive cinema. I mean, this can be perceived as the only right way, actually, to tell a story, which I think you addressed also at the beginning, which is, of course, from filmmakers' point of view, a very dangerous scenario for European film, which is still author cinema, which is also, this is not a problem that is limited only to the film world, because European cinema and native cinemas are the reflection and heritage of our culture. And I mean, if we resort only to one pattern, then would it be not over-exaggerated to say that our cultures are in danger?
Yeah, I mean, I think the danger is something to become commonplace or routinized. And I did try to stress there that, we can and probably should study Hollywood films at great mainstream cinemas, because it's not just Hollywood that is mainstream, because actually, the art house is becoming increasingly codified. The so-called festival film now has a certain template and, visual strategy, I think. And so you don't want something to become, it's a trade-off between something becoming a tradition that others can draw upon, but you don't want it to become kind of enclosed and cut off. And one thing, I like many things about these kinds of films, but one thing is that they are challenging because they're not spoon-feeding you their meaning, and they're giving you the space in which you can come to your own conclusions, and your mind may even wander while you're watching it, and that's it. And I made a point of trying to physically discipline my own body when I was watching it, because if I become aware of the fact that I'm fidgeting, I get bored, because I feel like I'm becoming aware of my own frustration with the film. Whereas if you try to sort of discipline your body so that it's in a kind of rhythm, metaphysical rhythm with the film, interestingly, I found that time went super fast through the 3 hours when I was able to kind of really concentrate my physical presence. And then other times I was like, geez, come on, well, how long have we got left? And then you start to count. So every so often in the film, a train does go by, an old freight train on the railroad, and you think, okay, so the next train, I'm definitely going to count how many carriages there are, or freight containers on this train, and you get up to something like 36, and you realize you've lost count because of the repetitive nature of the image becomes so abstract that you've forgotten if you've counted that carriage or not, because they're all identical. It's great. I love cinema.
This would be more of a theoretical question, but as some members of our audience are school teachers. I believe that one very important question to ask is how do we invite young audiences to a content like that? And obviously, maybe it would be done gradually, maybe with more, maybe like not so slow-paced content, but anyhow, how do we enter this world?
Little by little, we'll brainwash them. I don't know. I mean, I'm opening up to other teachers here who have experience in, engagement strategies and outreach strategies. But, in the UK, I mean, I'm going to talk here specifically about the UK university levels, which I'm not a high school teacher, so I don't know what's in place at the moment. And this is a landscape that's rapidly changing, right, in line with, neoliberal requirements and whatever else. But we have in the UK the research development framework, which everything now is becoming a diagram. So, like, you've got diagrams and they're meant to sort of solve society's problems. So you've got like a quarter diagram here, and it breaks learning down into learning at a university level. The assumption being that if you're at university, you're going to become a researcher or an academic. I mean, good luck. But it breaks everything down into very neat boxes. So we have knowledge and intellectual capabilities, which is one quarter. On another quarter, we have personal effectiveness. I mean, what does that even mean? But again, each of these four categories has their own bullet points to then further explain. You've got research organization, which doesn't really apply to young kids, I don't think, or it shouldn't. And then you've got engagement, influence, and impact, which is definitely university level. And then alongside that, you've got the training needs analysis, whereby you look at this quartered pie chart diagram kind of thing, and you map that against, and you've got a list of technical requirements in terms of what you need to do in order to develop your research and skills and whatever else. I mean, that is a very technical sort of stats-driven, orient-driven, outcome-based process. But if we could somehow, I find it personally rewarding to kind of map my own, where I am as a researcher against that. But obviously it would be cruel and absurd and probably, disastrous to introduce it at a school level. I think there's a balance to be had between, showing films in such a way that it feels like not a game, but there's something to get from it, right? I mean, kids are growing up faster than ever, I think, because of media, actually. So it's a dialectical relationship here. Because of that, they're more aware of themselves as consumers. So education is something now it's a service increasingly that you pay for. And because of that, they're more aware of their rights, they're more aware of their time and the effort that they need to make as students. And if something, in my experience, if something isn't going to quantifiably go towards their final grade, they won't do it. And so you have to kind of find ways in which, you introduce elements of the education that is actually going to have some kind of, it's going to inform where or what kind of grade they get. I don't know how that's done. I mean, it's definitely not going to be done overnight. But as I said, this is a landscape that's rapidly changing, at least in the UK, and I can only speak from a UK perspective. I don't know.
I think this would be the right time to ask our audience members who work with children in classrooms to maybe share their experiences of if you use film in your learning processes, how, and if not, maybe it would be interesting to know why. I think there is the mic, so...
There's also an interpreter on hand for me if in the event somebody wants to ask it in Latvian.
Teachers, please. while you're thinking about your answers, I can say that in Latvian educational system for now, it is not self-evident, not evident to bring children to cinemas. Right now we have the centennial school program, which encourages the visits of cultural events, but before I think it was largely dependent on the teachers themselves to one make a deal with the whole class of pupils to go to movie. The second point is that they can't really go during the classroom. Afterwards, as you can all well imagine, it proves to be complicated. And then the third option, if they do, after all, manage to go and see a movie, then the next problem is there sufficient time in the curriculum to speak about what they have seen, which is obviously a very local problem. Maybe someone can prove me wrong. I hope so, please. But right now with the Centennial program, the cultural rucksack, things are changing, and we as a festival have also experienced school groups coming to see films, and they are all pleasantly surprised that, wow, this is actually really nice content. It's not some kind of high shelf festival film. And maybe you, if you know the UK experience in this terms, maybe you can share.
I mean, it's in the interest of cinemas to have education and outreach schemes as well, because from their point of view, they're sort of educating kids to become the next generation of consumers. So it's there's the extraction of capital as well that I keep going on about, but it doesn't have to be. We don't have to be cynical about that. It's an opportunity for there to be a two-way relationship, and to sort of build or maintain a cinephile culture. I mean, you've got great cinemas here in terms of physical venues, regionally, even locally. And, as it's going to get increasingly difficult for cinemas to stay open, I think, because it will, I think it would be extremely beneficial to both cinemas and to schools and to children to sort of not return to an era, I don't want to get nostalgic, but to re-romanticize or to begin again to romanticize cinemas as social spaces. Like I remember going to see my first ever film at the cinema, which was My Girl, right? Very, very tragic film. But I remember being absolutely like mesmerized by all of the different blemishes on the 35mm print, and like the cigarette burn in the corner of the screen. And I remember that, but it wasn't like in any sort of intellectual way. It was just a visceral connection that I had immediately with the screen. And I suspect that hasn't changed. It's still going to see a film on the big screen. Okay, the vast majority of films now are screened digitally, so you get the crispness and so the image itself has lost something of its texture. But there's no reason why I think schools can't organise group visits to cinemas, and they should, and they do. But schools are nervous, and I'm quoting James Benning here because again at Carl Arts he had a listening and seeing class where he would literally introduce practicing filmmaking students to the idea of listening and looking, and he would go and take them outside not to see films but to just be still in a space and absorb the energy of that space and viscerally respond to it and then intellectualize that process. And then he stopped it a few years ago and he said, schools are nervous and there's more lawyers in the world now. And the university, it had become an institution by which it had to follow protocol. Again, for understandable reasons, especially in America, a culture in which people make money from suing each other. But it had become such a way where the institution wasn't liable if anything was to happen to any student outside of university grounds, and that he would be as a teacher. And you know, such as the nature, the legal framework of society, that you know, it's unreasonable to place that upon the teacher. I mean, I remember going to cinema at the end of term as a school trip. You know, we went to see Spider-Man, yeah, 2002, Spider, and like you know, the new Star Wars films. But you know, I'm speaking from a perspective of somebody who was kind of always interested in cinema, so I can't really say how I got into films. Like, I don't. Yeah, it's strange.
Speaking about schools getting nervous, which is a very normal thing to do since you're responsible for children. Maybe a very broad question, but if we're speaking about youth content, where is the border of what is safe for this or that age group and what is not? This is a very blurry line, and as you mentioned, kids grow up really fast.
Yeah.
And how do we find a point of repair in this situation?
I mean, I'd like to open that up to the floor. I mean, I'd love to hear different responses to that, because it's the kind of question that I suspect would, you know, provoke wildly different answers. I don't know. I'm happy to hear some perspectives.
I'm not a teacher, but I would like to share. I finished high school here in Riga, and when we were at the age of 13, 14, we went to the cinema to watch a couple of movies on Russian literature towards writers, and some Latvian as well. And I remember it as a great event in itself, going in a big group, going together with a teacher. We had to be disciplined, we have to stay in pairs. And afterwards, we had to write an essay. So it was an obligatory event, and we had to do a homework on that. And now that, Christina, right, you're saying that there is some sort of a discussion between schools and the Ministry of Culture, I understand. It's dangerous to bring the school to the cinema, to bring the class, then it involves some organization and logistics as well. But it's a great tool for the kids to, first of all, to learn discipline as one of the things, and then again to do a homework on that. And my question to Michael was, what you're saying, I think, is so significant because of the pace of the, now I'm thinking about cartoons. I watched Frozen recently. I think it's from 2014, quite an old cartoon, I would say. The first 30 minutes were so depressing. It's incredible. I almost cried, and I'm not a child. And then I spoke to a couple of friends, and their children from 2 to 4, they watched this cartoon, they love it, and they didn't cry. Then I'm thinking about Smurfs, and I don't remember the name exactly of that cartoon, one of the first. And when it starts, it's so fast. They are moving so fast on the screen, I had to stop watching. My head started turning around, honestly. I'm not saying if it's good, if it's bad. I want to hear the opinion of Michael, Christine as well. And Michael, if you, on your level, you're doing your PhD as well, so you're doing your research, can you influence the British Minister of Culture, British Council somehow, and at least in UK to change the pace of cartoons? Thank you.
No. I mean, it's interesting because I associate fastness in movies with humor, with wit, and the rhythm of humor translates, I think, particularly well to cartoons and animation, because animation lends itself to spatially impossible things that you can't really do with cameras. I mean, you can, but it's a lot more sort of dynamic. You can visualize it in a much more dynamic way, potentially through animation. So when I watch, you know, I went to see The Incredibles 2 earlier this year, and yeah, I mean, a large part of that film's pace is to do with its kind of visual wit and the rhythm of humor and comedy. I can't think of a fast, sad film. I mean, I haven't seen Frozen. I'd love to see it now. I'm intrigued by the idea that it's simultaneously rapid in its rhythm.
Sorry, Frozen was not rapid.
Aha, it's good. Okay, okay, right. Because I thought you were saying it was fast, but also at the same time depressing.
Later stage was fast.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you know, the Pixar film Up is like, it was famous at the time for being incredibly emotionally moving in its opening montage, and you know, I always mistime my visits to the cinema to see these films because there's a reason why they're released during school holidays, and I always forget that. And so I was sitting there, a fully grown man, surrounded by children who just were like not really responding to, or, you know, consuming the film in any kind of disciplined way. But you can't tell a kid to shut up, right? So I was having to kind of map my emotional experience and kind of balance it out with the fact that I was surrounded by chaos. So as a result of which, I wasn't engaged really by Up. But having watched it again recently, I was like, yeah, I mean, it's working on a very basic emotional level that is nevertheless very, very sophisticated in how it pitches itself to an adult audience, and is also understandable, I think, on a animal emotional level to kids, right, of all ages, or a broad range of ages. And I think, you know, mainstream animation and mainstream kids movies are very good at that. You know, there's a reason why they make money, and there's a reason why there's a whole industry about them. If they weren't popular with kids, they wouldn't make them. I mentioned, you know, the dark side of children's videos on YouTube that are now being made via algorithms. And they're kind of nonsensical. They have a story, but they don't really. And, you know, they're made by algorithms, so you get a lot of them where the appearance of a character has changed, but it's basically the same scenario. And they're kind of violent, and the tone of them is very sort of sinister. And I felt very unsettled watching them, firstly because I didn't know they existed, and then I felt like, oh my God, I'm going to fall down a rabbit hole here online at 3 o'clock in the morning watching these things, and I'm never going to get out of it. But the fact that they can be made without any kind of human input almost, it's sinister, and I don't like it. And you know, I don't really know where I stand with regard to policing content or policing access to content. I mean, you know, the age of consent, if you like, with regard to what we consume and what we don't, and what we have access to, is going to fluctuate from culture to culture, I think. And, you know, what is acceptable to screen to kids and what isn't. But the idea of, I don't know, I feel like I'm going to start sounding very moralistic, and I don't want to.
I'll take it from here.
Yeah, please do.
About the cultural ministry, and I think both the educational ministry of Latvia and cultural ministry are doing the best they can now, because the content, like the speed we're getting new content and new forms, it's not only super speedy at Smurfs, it's, I mean, new materials keep coming in at the same pace. And I mean, it's not only for educational or cultural systems now to be able to react and to impose some measures or to decide how are we going to deal with this, but I think we're now on a very good way with this cultural rucksack, because I was so happy to see kids streaming into theaters with their teachers, and that is a very worthy initiative, because beforehand, and I'm saying this as a result of, I don't know, 3-4 years of discussions, because we have been discussing with teachers and with representatives of ministry. And at the end of the day, we just saw the problem is that the teacher is left by himself with no help of educating himself or herself about on this audiovisual content. Then also with very narrow possibilities of bringing the kids to see a movie. And of course, it's like, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 very enthusiastic teachers who like fight their own battles and finally bring their kids. But I mean, the system should be more welcoming. And right now, I'm really pleased to say that in Latvia, it's turning that way, because it's, I think, the only way actually to somehow have a society that can think for themselves, and it's not only something that is actual now in the film world. It's a matter for us all and everyone.
I mean, I think there's an assumption that, you know, a kids' film has to be, as you said, like providing new information all of the time. What I would argue is that these kinds of films do that if you're willing to, or if you're able to kind of, as I keep saying, de-educate yourself from what is commonly assumed to be the best form of information delivery. I mean, the schemes are there, and you know, there is already kind of, even in the UK, you know, education and outreach schemes for local cinemas. They're not screening this kind of stuff. I don't expect them to, and I would rather like have a variety of different kinds of films rather than just this kind of film. I mean, you know, it's not for everyone, as I said. But I mean, I wonder if, you know, virtual reality is going to change things as well, because, you know, kids, I think, are now, they have a wealth of technology at their disposal and are therefore much more inclined to be excited by new technology. And I think virtual reality could possibly change things in terms of engaging students in that way. I'd love to, you know, see a bunch of kids watching one of these films and, like, you know, because it's almost like, well, assimilating their world. And I have problems with VR anyway, but I'd be interested in looking at it as a potential device by which kids become aware of their environment in the real world as something that is also mediated in many ways. And I think virtual reality could get things to get kids to kind of think about that. Another thing to repeat here is that you can't just show films without some kind of educational framework around them. And I think this is why, Christina, you were on about, like, you know, these kinds of initiatives are always limited by who's in charge of it, who can lead that expertise, but they can be helped and supported by institutionalized and systematized systems of thinking. So, like, something like I said before, like, you know, things are in place at a university level for becoming an expert in that field, but you can wind it back a little bit, and you can become a lot more generic or general in what you're prescribing, you know, the educational framework. Don't forget that, like, a primary school, teachers haven't specialized. They don't specialize in something. They have to teach basic, you know, language skills, mathematics, science, everything. And I don't see any reason why cinema can't be included in that, to be honest.
I completely agree, because most of the films targeted for youth audiences generally address very human, very emotional, very social themes, which are here around. They concern each and every one of us, and also about the selection of the content, as you mentioned, that it depends who's in charge. I'm sorry, but where to look for good content. Okay, we can maybe praise ourselves and say that the festival does a bit of a job here, but for example, for teachers and other educational stuff, how to orientate themselves.
I don't know.
Which you use maybe. Does anyone of you work with this Latvian film initiative? And how could you share how it works?
Microphone, please.
We watch Latvian films, like classic Latvian films based on on books of Latvian authors. Then, since I have the microphone, maybe my question would be, there is tradition of criticism in the art, in the literature. Is there a tradition of criticism in films that would help teachers to guide kids, like what they should see in a certain movie? Because we have that with books, like we know what we want kids to see in a book, what answers they should give us. Maybe it's not right, but that's what we have. That's like, is there something like that with movies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it happens. Yeah, inevitably, it does happen. I liked what you said there in terms of maybe it's not right, but it should be in place because yeah, I mean, which is why I stressed at the beginning of my talk that it's important to teach people how to think and not what to think. My utopian concept there is that if you teach people how to think, they'll think the right things, which obviously doesn't necessarily come to fruition. But yeah, I mean, look, there's an entire history and discipline of film pedagogy, and you know, there's more and more. There's a developing field now on a scholarly level, on an academic level, of how to teach film from all age ranges, and I have colleagues who can speak on that with much more authority than I can. But there are films in place. I mean, I would love to know what kinds of films people personally would recommend for teaching kids, and also what they would expect from those films in terms of what they teach. You know, I think like I remember this is at high school, so it's not like I wasn't like a kid, but obviously I still wasn't an adult really by legal requirements. And I remember watching a clip of Francois Truffaut's The 400 Blows in my French lesson, and that was shown to us in class only to give us some idea of French society. And I, you know, again, I'm saying all of this having already been sufficiently interested in film, so I don't know what the rest of the class were thinking when they seen this subtitled black and white film. But I was like, oh my God, I want to see the rest of that now. And I don't know, is if the rest of the class weren't engaged by the idea of watching more, is that because they don't like films, or is that because they haven't been taught how to watch films? And I think, you know, a large part of this is teaching people how to watch films, because, you know, we learn how to read, we develop at a certain point some understanding of how to read critically. That should also really be, you know, included with regard to cinema as well, I think, to be honest, especially since it's, you know, the most sort of easily transported artistic medium.
Any more questions? If not, then I am out of questions. So I'll just say thank you, Michael. Thank you, dear audience. Oh, no, one last question.
I wanted to ask, do you think, because Christine before asked, like how teachers can search for information to teach their students and children, but do you think it's also important to teach not only how to watch movies or how to something like that, but also how to search for the right information, especially in this age when there's a lot of free content flowing around for everyone basically. And even though if you, I don't know, take the students to see a movie or you show it in class, they still have this free opportunity to search for everything what they like at home. And I think that also gives an impact like to what they see and what they learn. So it may be also important to teach that as how to differentiate the information that is free for them to see and everything.
Yeah, it's a good. Thanks. It depends on the age of the kids, obviously, of children. I think what you're referring to here is actually like teaching also children from a younger age than what we commonly teach them is research skills and actually drawing their attention to databases and, you know, online forms of access to not necessarily maybe even to films themselves, but perhaps to the the meta material, if you like, the material around films. I mean, I can't imagine that being particularly of use to, you know, 6-year-olds, but I don't really know the age group that we're talking about here when we talk about those kinds of things. What kind of age group were you thinking?
I thought that the only thing that keeps a young person from not watching something, for example, on YouTube, which is all free content, is just clicking a button that they're 18 years old, and there's or maybe like okay, their parents are using some parental guidelines on the internet or something. But if not, then that is the only thing that's stopping them from, I don't know, looking at stupid videos or and engaging in those or something. So basically, the age group could be anything like from starting, I don't know, when they get an iPod or iPad, I don't know, like a technical device on which they can freely do whatever they want. So it could be even sometimes 7, 8 year olds up to like 12, 13, 14 when they really, really start to engage. And I think that's also the age where a person sucks in information very, very deeply. I think it's starting at that age. So
Yeah.
it could be kind of important to teach something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a gatekeeping issue, and there are government bodies and research committees dedicated ongoing, in the UK at least, and I suspect everywhere else, in terms of what is acceptable and what isn't. And a large part of media literacy initiatives are also, you know, web safety initiatives. Because we're living in a world where increasingly the internet is kind of dictating the speed with which these issues are developing. So yeah, I think it's super important to incorporate that, and it's probably important also to incorporate it alongside and integrate it into learning about films, as learning about access points and access routes and what, you know, the kinds of films that we should have access to, if that answers your question. Yeah.
I think I can maybe add to this is a very topical question, but I think the only thing that we as adults or teachers or content providers can do is to talk about all kinds of content and tell that it's there. And I completely hear you. There are a lot of violent, a lot of inappropriate content available for kids starting from day one. And I think us as academia and also as a festival and educational workers, our biggest collective mistake is that we have been maybe, by trying to be overprotective, we somehow have acted that this content does not exist there, but it does, and I think the key is just to address it and somehow try to explain this difference between good content, bad content, and this is where the criticality comes in.
I think we had another question.
Sorry. If I can ask a question about one of the clips. The second one you showed, the first one was without the sound, and the second was with the sound, with the sound and the image. So you were standing in sort of a passageway, and there was a gentleman passing, drinking beer, probably. So, and he passed, I think, 4 times, if I'm not mistaken.
He passes 3 times, and on the 4th pass, it cuts to the end.
Ah, okay. Sorry.
As he's mid-swig.
So, first question. Did you edit it, or was it done like that, that he really passes 4 times?
So this is what I meant when I said decoding. It's a good question, because it gets, I think, the greatest experimental films. No, I think, like, it's designed. So I'm glad you asked the question. So yeah, I edited it. There's 3 dissolves in the film.
Okay, because for me, sorry if I'm saying that, it's not very significant, but I started thinking how you did that, and if you park the car in front so that crawl behind and then pass again, and then you put the cross on the pavement where he would do the drinking party.
It's not an actor. Honestly, I have no idea who the guy is. I was filming the HSBC Canary Wharf that you can see in London, which is the financial district of London. And I was actually making another film, Lee River Bridges, on the route that I was walking. And it just felt like the sky was nice. It was a nice colour. It was a cold January day. And actually, I was filming, hoping that during me recording, the lamp that we see in the alleyway would turn on. And that would be the film. That would be like the action shot. And then I realised I could be here for hours. The lamp's not going to, turn on. So, but then some guy just randomly walks by, and it was almost as if he's directed, because he just, takes a swig of the can, and he didn't even know there was a camera there.
Okay.
So yeah.
Thank you. And the second question, not connected to the clip. After yesterday's event, I did some research, and I saw you wrote critics on a couple of documentaries. So I'm myself involved in one of the documentaries that we have filmed. So I wanted to ask you, what is the success of the documentary?
Of which one?
In general.
Like the commercial success or the critical or artistic success?
A success to be on a film festival.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, my own films don't even get selected at film festivals. So, I mean, knowing people helps. Knowing the people who are going to program your work helps a great deal, I've found. I don't know. I mean, it depends on the film and it depends on the festival.
Okay. Accepted. Thank you.
Okay.
So I would like to invite you all to continue with your questions without mics and without live stream. So thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, British Council Latvia. And see you very soon.
Thank you.